Okay. And everybody can hear me okay and we're good to go?
I believe so.
Okay, great. We had a few technical issues on Tuesday, so I'm glad we're able to make this happen.
I see a
Okay.
white screen, so maybe we're not having no, we've not
All right.
resolved the issues here,
We'll
but
we'll figure this out eventually.
okay. I promise it's worth the wait.
All right. It's saying my screen sharing is paused. There we
Okay.
go. All right.
There we are. Awesome.
Haha.
All right.
All right. We do history doesn't necessarily mean we do tech all that well. Thanks, Matt.
You're very
Okay.
welcome.
I want to thank, again, Montgomery History and Matt and everybody at Montgomery History for the invitation to come speak to you about Sugarland again today on a Friday evening. We figured this was an opportunity for people to hear the talk and learn a little bit about Sugarland who really aren't able to make it during regular working business hours. Uh, I'm actually, yeah, there. Okay, there's my opening slide. Uh, so I'm going to be talking today not going to give a full thorough history of Sugarland because that's really what our book is going to be for. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the sources that we used to put the forthcoming book together. Now, this week we debuted the title. It's the first time we put the title of our forthcoming book out in the world. For a year and a half, I've been working with Gwen Reese and Suzanne Johnson at the Sugarland Ethnohistory Project. They had before I contacted them, a pile of sources and stories and artifacts. And they were looking for, I guess, a writer with a fresh set of eyes to come in and help them turn it into a book. So I stepped in as a volunteer, and that's Gwen Reese on the right. She's been involved for about 25 years. Suzanne Johnson is next to her. I think I'm obviously the white dude standing there. And then next to me is Nettie LaMaster. She still lives at Sugarland. And when I talk about Sugarland as a community of historians, that's a tradition that she is definitely continuing because, in addition to having a great collection of materials, family materials, and community materials that she shared on this project, she was there at the beginning to help them get their nonprofit going. And she still comes with a camera to all of the current Sugarland events and documents them for future historians. So my contribution to this, I suppose, is I did some original research and I did find some new information along the way, but I really want to emphasize that the vast majority of the research and the collection and the preservation has been done by Gwen and Suzanne and their family members for 25 years, and in many cases, sometimes a lot longer. Their collection of sources, as I'm going to show you, is really unbelievable. And that's why for the last year and a half, we've been talking about this as a collaboration. And what I'm really doing is just helping them bring this project the last mile of the way. And I'm really pleased to have done so because, as far as we know, this is the first full-length history of a Reconstruction era African American town in Maryland. Now, there's been at least one dissertation and there's been a couple of articles, but as far as we know, there hasn't actually been another book on a town like Sugarland. The book I have started for Canaan, the title is based on a hymn that we know was especially important to somebody at Sugarland in the 19th century. And it'll be out this summer. We've gotten lots of offers of assistance from local history organizations that are going to help us get the word out. And we were hoping to debut it at the county's Heritage Weekend at the end of June, but Heritage Weekend has been canceled. So at some point, we are still hoping to have a big in-person party to celebrate the publication. But in the meantime, and when the book will be out, probably late June, early July, we'll be promoting it and selling it online and mailing it out to people. And I will gladly drop it off on people's doorsteps in the Poolsville area if if that's what really needs to be done. And the book is going to be a fundraiser for the nonprofit Sugarland Project to help them keep up their historic church and to handle other projects that they have in the works all around their historic building and the land that they own. Excuse me, and the educational projects that they have in the works. So probably the best place to start is by talking about where Sugarland is. Uh, for those of you who are tuning in today from outside the area, Montgomery County is the huge county just northwest of Washington, D.C. You can see the diamond shape there at the bottom of that map. And it used to be a very sparsely populated farming area. And or at the start of the Civil War, only about 18,000 people lived in the entire county. And you can see it's a vast county. So that's really just a small number of people sprinkled across fields and farmlands. And over the 20th century, most of it suburbanized, and we now have more than 1 million residents. But the area of the county that we're talking about tonight, the upper western portion out there by Poolesville and Sugarland, is still really rather rural. It's part of a county reserve that's zoned for agriculture and farming that happened around 1980. And the center of life out here is Poolesville, which is the biggest town that has about 5,000, 5,500 relatives or so, or residents or so. So Sugarland is about 5 miles southeast of Poolesville. It's about 5 miles southwest of the town of Dawsonville, which is the scary merge for those of you who drive out in this direction, coming west from Rockville. It's 4 miles north of the Potomac River, and it's a little wet. So the farmland was good, but people have often had problems getting their wells to perk there. Sugarland's about 20 miles northwest of DC, and as I mentioned, it's within the 93,000 acre agricultural reserve that was established in 1980. So that's where Sugarland is. It's at the intersection of Sugarland Road and Sugarland Lane, which you can still visit today. So let's start with some basic facts. There were at least 40 historic Black communities in Montgomery County. And after the Civil War, the Black population of Montgomery County was about 30% of the population as a whole. So I think it's pretty interesting and significant that the families that founded Sugarland did not go to far-flung places to establish their town. There were advertisements in the late 19th century for African-American towns that were springing up in Oklahoma and Mississippi and other places, and they chose to stay pretty much, right where they had grown up, right where they were living. It was their home too. Now, emancipation in Maryland occurred in November of 1864. That required a vote by eligible voters at the time to change the Constitution. And that was something that happened, that went into effect November 1st, 1864. As you may recall, Maryland was a border state during the Civil War. So Maryland was really divided between the North and South. And our area out here of Montgomery County in particular was generally leaning toward the Confederacy. So the fact that they changed the Constitution during the Civil War and before it ended by a hair was really an interesting historic point. Now, the first recorded land ownership by African Americans at Sugarland is in 1871. Those are the oldest deeds that they have in their collection. But some families almost definitely lived there earlier. There's a tradition at Sugarland that they were living there sometime between 1864 and 1871 on a handshake deal, where it was sort of a gentleman's agreement, and then they formalized it a couple years later once these informal mortgages were paid off. Now, the town was also known as Curtisville for the Curtis family that was probably there pretty early, and Taylor's Chapel for a minister preacher who lived there and played a key role in the community. That was a fairly common thing to do in the late 19th century, was to name your church after one of the ministers or somebody who helped found it, or something along those lines. Now, this Sugarland was one of 12 or more African-American settlements in our western upper portion of Montgomery County, and each one had its own distinctive character. Something I found over the course of my research and over the course of meeting people who are descended from the founding families of many of these other communities. They all had their own personality, they all had their own way of doing things, and they all had their own destiny. Now, there's a reason I'm calling Sugarland a town and not just a community or a settlement. Because at its height, I think Sugarland really qualified. It had more than 100 residents, probably 150 or more after a certain point. They owned around 200 acres of land. So they were not sharecroppers. They actually owned their own property. In some cases, up to there are a couple families there that owned 12 acres, 25 acres. Uh, they had 25 homesteads with every outbuilding you would possibly need in a farming community. They had a church with eventually with a community hall next to it when they built a new church that replaced their old church. They had a schoolhouse. They had a general store. They had a post office with only the second black postmaster in Maryland. And probably one of my favorite details, they had a practice hall for the town band. The town band was formed in the 1890s. Any proper town back then had a town band. Poolesville had one. I believe Dawsonville had one. All the other local towns had one. So, of course, Sugarland had one too. It was the Sugarnet Cornet Band. Uh, and we actually know quite a bit about who was in the band and what instruments they played. And so it really gives you a sense of them building not just a crossroads, not just a neighborhood, not just a community, but an actual town. So who were the founders and families of Sugarland, and what were they like? What were they like? Well, we know from various records and a social science study done as recently as 1946 that well into the 20th century, 98.5% of the Black residents of Montgomery County were either farm laborers if they were men, or if women worked outside the home, they were domestic workers for white families. Now, only 1.5% were professionals, mostly teachers, and there was one doctor, one black doctor who was not allowed to join the county medical association. Now, there were a few pipe layers, a few truck drivers, a few bus drivers, a few janitors, people who had picked up some skills along the way, although not in formal apprenticeships. And there were no formally trained carpenters, electricians, or mechanics. They picked up some of those skills on the fly. They knew how to do those things, but they didn't have the official training, the certification, the apprenticeship to really go out into the wider world and show their credentials. And there were no black nurses or lawyers as late as 1946. So the pictures that I have up on the screen now really shows you a group of men who came by to visit from the nearby Darnestown area in their work clothes. And you see my friend Suzanne Johnson's grandmother, Annie Lee, coming home from a hard day's work in somebody else's home. But speaking about them as farm laborers and domestic workers is really just a generalization that doesn't tell us, I don't think, really enough about who they were. It's really what they did for a living is really not the entirety of who they were. And you look at the range of pictures that they have in their collection. They were churchgoers who built their own church. That's the choir up at the top there in the 1950s. And they built their community around their church, including using it as a courthouse in the evenings to settle disputes. It was essentially the governing body of the town. They were preachers and ministers, and that's Reverend Benjamin Franklin Hall down there in the middle, World War I veteran turned minister of Sugarland and some of the other local black churches. Some of the ministers in the late 1800s helped found two other churches in the area. So they had skill at getting things done and getting churches built in communities that had never had them before. They served, as you can see up there on the right, in the military. Men from Sugarland have served in every war since the Civil War, and I hope this tantalizes you a little bit. They served on both sides of the Civil War, and that's a story we're gonna tell in the book to the extent that we can. They valued education. Down there in the bottom right corner, that's I think the class of 1932 posing in front of the Sugarland School. They built a schoolhouse almost as quickly as they could. They started school after emancipation in their church, and a couple years later, the church trustees said, "No, we think you need a building." So they built a schoolhouse and made sure that their children had a place to learn. And just one generation past slavery, pretty much everybody, as far as I can tell, almost everybody could read or write. Most of the kids attended school. It was something that the Sugarland families really cared about a great deal, to give their kids a leg up in the world. As I mentioned, there was a town band. So there were musicians, and two of the best gospel groups in Montgomery County, one that's a bunch of young guys who are active now, and some older guys who were kind of retired in the last few years or passed away. those two gospel groups have Sugarland roots. Their mutual ancestor was the person up here in the left, Isaac Bell. Uh, so there's a musical tradition that Sugarland has passed along to the world. Sugarland residents were there during the integration of county schools. And as you'll see in the book this summer, they were there, they were always there when other racial barriers fell down as well. They were there for every, what you might call a hinge in county and state and national history. Now, even though they often worked on the farms of white farmers in the area, they knew how to live off the land. And when hard times came, they were self-sufficient. And they were very proud to be self-sufficient. Uh, Remember, as I said just a couple of minutes ago, they were not sharecroppers. Their land was their own. And they were able to make a living off of that land and survive off of that land during lean times. It was something that again and again, Sugarland descendants have told me was extremely, extremely important to them. So people use phrases like the African-American experience, but when you spend time immersed in the history of a community like Sugarland, and in their history, you see that there's no one single African-American experience. Out here in our neck of the woods, there were, as I mentioned, a dozen 19th century Black communities, including one called Big Woods, that's just up the road from where I'm sitting right now, that was established by free Black families in the early 1800s. Now, all of these Black communities along the Potomac, from DC all the way up into Montgomery County in West Virginia, they all overlapped. But as I mentioned, each one had its own character and its own tone and its own destiny. And 5, 6, 7 generations later, many of their descendants are still in the area. And they're living this legacy. It's a legacy of strong religious faith and appreciation for their history, but also looking forward, looking ahead and seeing what else they can accomplish in the world. They're looking forward and looking back at the same time. So, I've come to realize that the Sugarland story isn't just of interest in our little corner of the world, because there just aren't that many full histories of independent African-American towns in the country. People just haven't gone ahead and written those histories. So I think no matter where you're from tonight or what your background is, I think in the end, I hope this wets your whistle a little bit to learn a little bit more. And I think when you read the book this summer, I think you're going to be really impressed by what they managed to achieve from starting with nothing. Now, I'm not going to tell the story of Sugarland today because that really does require a full-length book. But I'd like to walk you through how we know what we know about Sugarland. And I've put on the screen here pretty much where I got started as a relative newcomer to local and county history. So it's really a process of starting generally and getting to know the subject well and getting to know the history of the area before zooming in on a single town. So I started with basic histories of the county. I just sort of crammed and read as thoroughly as I could. And the range of material available just on our county in general is really terrific. We've got 2 books up there by Nina Clark, I believe is about 103 years old right now. And she has written histories of the Black churches and the public schools. And those books are like encyclopedias, full of information, names, dates, records, you name it. We have a local historian, Tony Cohen. I think many of you probably know Tony, who's written the first ever guide to the Underground Railroad in Montgomery County, and I know he's revising that book even as we speak. There are histories of local towns. There are histories of the county in general. There's the County Historical Society newsletter that I think Matt will like me telling you that you receive in the mail with a $60 membership. And they've got their terrific research library in Rockville that you can go visit as well. County resident Jim Johnston also wrote this book that got national attention, From Slave Ship to Harvard, that tells the story of how these Black and white communities are interconnected from DC all the way up the Potomac. And that'll shed a lot of light on the area for you as well. But I want to single out one historian in particular, and his name is George McDaniel. And he's sitting up there holding the clipboard in that upper right photo. In the late 1970s, as a graduate student, George researched and documented these Black communities in the Western Up County area. And you see him sitting there with Tillman Lee Sr. of Sugarland. And he published in 1979 an extremely rare book that you see there on the left, uh, through the organization Sugarloaf Regional Trails. And this is a very hard book to find. If you ever spot it sitting around somewhere, definitely pick it up. Uh, so he provided everything that he could pull together on all of these towns in this book, and he also compiled. I put an example down here on the right, more than 100 inventory forms for the Maryland Historic Trust. He was especially interested in buildings, so he documented schools, churches, houses, but in a short amount of time, he also collected a ton of information about land records, census records, family trees, community life, uh, how people live, things they did in the community, the state of some of the buildings, stories people told about some of the buildings. So this is a tremendous resource that helped me hit the ground running and served as a baseline for where we should start working on this book. So he also took some incredible photos, not just of buildings, but of people posing with photos of their ancestors. And here's Tillman Lee Sr. and his wife Bessie Lee, and they're both posing outside with photos of their ancestors. And there were several pictures of Tillman Lee doing this, but this was my favorite because he's just looking down and smiling. And this was really important that George McDaniel took these pictures, because in some cases I'm not always sure that the pictures have survived. So at least we now have these beautiful pictures to zoom in on, and George's notes, so we know who people are, and we don't necessarily have to have the original photo to rely on these. Uh, Another amazing thing that George McDaniel did was he commissioned maps, including this map of Sugarland from the memory of two locals, Tillman Lee, who you saw on the previous slide, and Bill Lyles. And these maps are really something else, because you can see what they include. They include outbuildings, they include paths, they include streams, they include uh, the hen houses, they include marshy areas, you name it, and it's on there. Now I know this is probably a little hard to see on your screen because the map is really very small, but this is something that a lot of communities just don't have and never have. Knowing pretty much exactly where the chicken coops were, and where everybody lived, and where their boundaries were. And it doesn't have to be a perfect scale map to still be extremely useful. Now, afterwards, George McDaniel went on to become the director of Drayton Hall in South Carolina. And that was an old estate where he spent 26 years turning this sort of dilapidated site into really a world-class historic site. And one thing that George pioneered at Drayton Hall was discussions between descendants of the white property owners and descendants of the enslaved workers who lived there for generations afterwards. And he really emphasized that if your histories are intertwined, you should be talking to each other. And I think that's equally true in Montgomery County as it is in South Carolina. And I like to think that George's work in South Carolina got its start here in Montgomery County, and that our Black communities here in Montgomery County get a little bit of credit for that, because it's some good work that's resonated now for 40, 50 years. Now, where we got started when I first met with Gwen and Suzanne and we first started talking and getting to know each other was they started to share with me their voluminous collection of public records. They have records like you would not believe. Suzanne has spent a fair amount of time, I think, at the State Archive in Annapolis, and over the years, students at Howard University and Montgomery College have helped to dig up a lot of these records as well. It's a seemingly bottomless well of sources, and I'm positive I haven't even seen anything in their collection. What you see on the right there is from one of the folios. It's a public record of the land sale of the property where the church and the cemetery are now located at Sugarland. Most of these are, they use pretty standard legal language, and they really don't have any surprises in them. They tell you how many acres and perches and rods the size of the property is, using all these archaic terms, and who sold it to whom and what the terms are. But a few of these land records contain some interesting surprises. The one for the church that you see there has some very interesting stipulations in it, and that's going to be an appendix in the book, so you can read the whole thing. I've had legal historians look at it, and they found it very intriguing. In other cases, there are four, I think at least four homesteads that were sold to the women and not the men in the family, which is a bit unusual, I think, for the time. We don't quite know why, but that's uh, a source of interesting speculation. So, as I mentioned earlier, the oldest known land records date to 1871, which means that Sugarland officially celebrates its 150th birthday next year. But as I also mentioned, there's a tradition that they were there earlier on handshake deals. And I think that's true. My hunch is that they were there right after emancipation in Maryland in 1864. And it wouldn't surprise me to learn that there were a couple of maybe two or three free Black families living somewhere in the vicinity earlier. So this is an ongoing, the research is ongoing. This is not, we haven't done the be all and end all, and there's room for a lot of people to come in and pick up what we've been doing. Uh, so you also see up there on the left, you see census records, hugely, hugely useful. I think those of you who do family history and genealogy have gotten very comfortable at looking at these records. We learn a few things about Sugarland from these census records. We know the houses from the other information that was collected by George McDaniel, that the houses were very small, but there were large families living in those small houses, including people who were not necessarily relatives, just people who needed a place to live. And we can see families hosting other families while their homes are being built. We can see traces over time of freed slaves moving out of white households and into or onto their own property, into their own homes. And in one case, one of the white slave owning families bought the property right in the middle of Sugarland and held onto it for a couple of years until the people they had formerly enslaved were able to afford the property and move on to it themselves. So there are a lot of stories in the census records, if you read between the lines, and they shed a lot of light on the complexity of race relations at the times. A lot of people didn't really write down these conversations that they had after emancipation or during the lead up to emancipation. So we really have to kind of tease those stories out of the records that we have. Um, the other revealing thing about the census records is the sheer number of errors in these records. There are adults listed as being unable to read or write, but we have records of those same adults in their own handwriting from their time as the church secretary or the school superintendent. So you get a sense of how the census enumerators were going into these communities and making assumptions about the people they were documenting, maybe not even meeting them or asking them some of the literacy questions altogether. So we also have military records. There's a World War I registration card there. These tell stories as well, because if you've done family history, especially if you've done African-American family history, you have been made aware of the corner being clipped down here. Uh, the local draft boards in World War I were not supposed to be discriminating against anybody based on race, but clipping the corner was how the people in the draft board pretty much told each other that the potential draftee was African American. So that's one of those things. If you ever see a registration card with the corner clipped, that's what's going on there. We have death records. There's a death record down there for Mr. Basil Dorsey, signed by Dr. Nurse. That was his name, and he was a doctor up in Dawsonville. So we've got military records, we've got death records. The stuff that Gwen and Suzanne were able to share with me was and still is really surprising to me. And every time I think I've seen the bottom of it, they go into a box or a drawer, or Gwen comes out of her basement and she's got even more. And my mouth just hangs open, and Suzanne just laughs at me and tells me to close my mouth. It's really, really pretty amazing what they have. And this is not even the whole of it. Newspaper records have been hugely useful. Sugarland was a pretty peaceful place, so there aren't a lot of newspaper articles about crime, which is what newspapers tended to cover. And I think that's a good thing for the history of Sugarland. But the old newspapers tell us who the teachers were whenever the teachers were being appointed every fall. And that's useful because in many cases, we don't have that information anywhere else. And the newspapers also show us that this was not a community that was isolated, that they were surprisingly outward looking and connected with the rest of the world. The newspapers show us that Sugarland was involved in some political organizing for one of the parties in the early 1900s. Uh, we found that, and this is one of my favorite things of all. We found that descendants of one of the more politically active residents of Sugarland, uh, they headed north and they got established in Black high society in Philadelphia and founded two major African American philanthropic organizations that still exist today. They're national organizations. So these two groups that are still thriving, that you can read about in the book, they have clear Sugarland roots, which I think is quite interesting. We also found that three men from Sugarland were involved in a completely forgotten political movement in the early 1900s. It was a political movement that isn't even in most Black history textbooks because it wasn't rediscovered by historians until about 2005. So I'm just going to tantalize you with that. I'm not going to tell you what it was, but I can tell you that three men from Sugarland may have met President Teddy Roosevelt. So anybody whose picture of Sugarland was just a community of farmers just hanging out in the middle of nowhere, no, they were heavily involved in the world around them. And I fully expect that when more of the national and regional African American newspapers are digitized and made searchable, that we're going to find more references to Sugarland and the residents there. They were, since they had a post office, they were almost certainly receiving these newspapers by subscription through the U.S. mail. So I'm expecting a lot of interesting things to pop up in the years ahead. Now, I mentioned that Sugarland was a community of natural-born historians, and that was true then, and I think it's still true now with their descendants, because they have this incredible collection of photographs. These are just four of, I don't even know how many photographs, and again, every time I think I've seen them all, they show me more. They have pictures of relatives and friends from beyond the community. They have a few candid shots of life around the community, but then they have this wonderful collection of studio portraits taken in Baltimore and DC. Now, most of these are not dated, but they're cropped here. But most of them actually have the card that comes when you get your picture taken at the studio. So we at least know where they were taken. Now, I think even though we don't know exactly when they were taken or what the circumstances were, I think they're very meaningful because they tell us how these younger people at Sugarland, this first generation in the late 1800s and early 1900s, how they wanted to be perceived and how they saw themselves. And there's real variation in them. You see Lloyd Coates Jr. over here on the left. He was the son of Lloyd Coates Sr., who was one of the sort of patriarchs and founders of the town. And you look at how he's dressed in this. The suit doesn't really fit him perfectly, and it shows a lot of wear and tear on his coat. But this was a farmer. This was a farm laborer who still put on the best clothes he had to pose for a photo. And I think the look on his face just pretty much says, I am somebody. I matter in the world. And you look over here at Lloyd Mason, who just has no doubt. That's a very confident picture. And look how dapper he is. I mean, you just picture him on a horse riding across the countryside. And the two ladies that we have on this slide, Annie Lee chose to go very, very simple and elegant. And over there, Annie Mason, as you can see, went all out with her hat and her furs and everything else. So the personalities of the Sugarland residents and the first generation born there and raised there really starts to come out in these photos. And if you visit the Sugarland Church when the world reopens again, and you can go, there are many, many more examples of these photos decorating the church and on displays all around the inside of the church. So when you have land records and census records and military records, that's great. But when you can put names and faces and to those records, it really starts to tell a story of the human lives behind all of these different sources. Now, probably the most famous photo that has come out of Sugarland is the well photo. And this is really an icon of Sugarland history. This has been used at the Smithsonian. This is, if anybody who's attended a talk about Sugarland is familiar with this. Articles about Sugarland in newsletters and newspapers always use this photo, because sometimes historians get lucky and there's a candid shot of daily life. Now, somebody, I don't think anybody knows who, had a camera and occasionally took photos like this one. So we don't know who the photographer was, but we know exactly where this well was located, right there on Sugarland Lane, and we know who everybody in the photo was. And because we know who everybody in the photo was, it can be dated to 1934. And why take a picture of an adult drawing water from a well? Maybe it had just been restored. Maybe it had just been rebuilt. We don't really know, but this photo has it really encapsulates something important about Sugarland, this uh, multi-generational aspect of living there, plus the hard work required. I mean, look how hard it was to draw water from a well like this, one bucket at a time, and poured it to the neighboring homesteads. Uh, and this photo has also jogged the memories of quite a few old timers at Sugarland. I've been told that the man there, Mr. Samuel T. Jackson, I don't think he's wearing them in this photo, but apparently he really liked to wear the striped overalls and hat of a railroad worker, even though, as far as anybody knows, he did not work for the railroad. So people often express their personalities and their quirks through their clothing, and I think Mr. Jackson found a way to do that even through his work clothing. And here we get to see what kids were wearing on a typical day. Uh, we get to see really who takes pictures of people drawing water. It's very, very rare. So we get to see what daily life looked like. And I actually think that historians are going to learn more from this photo over time as the book comes out and more people have a chance to look at the photo and think about it a little bit. So on a side note, the well photo and several other photos from the Sugarland collection are here at the Smithsonian's new museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall, opened in 2016, I believe. And they're located in this house that you see on the right. That house was taken from Jonesville, which was right outside Poolesville. It was another African American community, just a few miles from Sugarland. And it's there in the museum to represent the transition from slavery to freedom. And it's been stripped down to its log roots. And you can actually go in there. You can walk inside the house, and a number of the Sugarland photos are there on display to help you imagine people living in the home. Now, George McDaniel, the historian I mentioned before, was involved in documenting this house back in the day. And he has said that because it's in this museum, it's probably the most visited African American house in the world. And I suspect he's probably right about that. So some of these Sugarland photos were also used, if you watched last year, the PBS documentary that Henry Louis Gates did about Reconstruction. Some of them were used as illustrations in that documentary as well on PBS. So these photos are kind of starting to get out in the world, and it's really going to be very neat that this summer we can finally tell the story behind a lot of those photos. So things start to get even more specific with the oral histories and personal recollections that my friends at Sugarland have in their collection. Now, the oldest one is from the Reverend Philip Johnson, who was in his teens during the Civil War. Now, he was one of only 22 Marylanders interviewed about their experiences in slavery for the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. And this is something you can find online. It was published by the Library of Congress. And his narrative is written in a very stereotypical dialect. And I think it's because the white interviewer didn't really quite know how to transcribe his speech. And I think it makes him sound less sophisticated than he probably actually was, because we know he went to school in DC for a while after emancipation, and he was later a licensed Methodist Episcopal preacher. He was one of 4 men in the town who officially had a license to exhort from the Methodist Episcopal Church. And he was an eyewitness to a lot of really important things. He describes incidents in buildings that are still standing in the Poolesville area. He very, very important source, and quite a find when it was brought to the Sugarland descendants' attention, I think probably about 25 or so years ago. And as you can see, his granddaughter, Dora Johnson Timbers, also provided an oral history as recently as 2002 before she passed away. And the Sugarland files are really full of oral histories that Gwen Reese and Suzanne Johnson have collected in recent years from their elders. And they talk about going to school, they talk about farming, they talk about church attendance, they talk about their families, they talk about things they did for fun, food preparation, how they can food. You name it. It's a wealth of information. Details that again tell you who the residents of Sugarland were as people. So and it just so happens that over the course of the last year and a half, I've had a question, and Gwen and Suzanne have been able to call up some of their elders who are in their 90s and ask them these questions and get answers to some of these questions. They still remember, uh, they still remember things like who was in the town band and what instruments they played. And this was a town band that was established in the 1890s. So this this just is just a reminder, I think, for all of us: speak to your elders while they're still around, because it's not just their stories that they're going to be sharing. They know things that happened at least one generation earlier. And this has just been a treasure trove of information, and it's given us a chance to, rather than just speaking in generalizations over and over again, we get to let the earlier generations from Sugarland speak in their own words. And that's really priceless. And there aren't a lot of towns that can say they're able to do that. All right, so the Sugarland collection also includes several church ledgers from different stages of history. That tall, skinny one from the 50s and 60s is certainly the most interesting looking one. But the one that's a real treasure trove is the one on the left, the one from the 1880s and 1890s. Now, the pastors and the members of the community didn't just use it for basic record keeping to record members and their baptisms and births and all that. And thank goodness they didn't, because for around 20 years, this little book served as a community notebook. They did record the Sunday collections and Sunday school attendance, and when they had fundraising rallies for the church, who contributed and what people were bringing. But this book also contains 2 years worth of minutes from the building committee. They had a building committee that oversaw the construction of the church in the 1890s, and a handwritten copy of the contract they had with the white builder from Poolesville. And their personality, you think, okay, these are just minutes from meetings and a legal contract. What do you learn about who they were as people from that? Well, it's really very charming, because they had a beef with the white contractor over money, and it's not clear exactly what the dispute was all about. But every time he showed up for one of their meetings where they needed to talk to him, they sat him down, and after the traditional prayers and singing of hymns, they made him sit there and listen to a reading of the contract from the first word to the last every single time. So you see a lot of their confidence shining through in some of these documents. There are records of disputes. This is how we know that the church served as a community courthouse in the evening, and there were juries of men and women combined who helped settle these disputes. And a couple of times things got really heated, and we've transcribed some of that for you in the book, because it's very vivid, and it's written in the hand of an eyewitness who was there as part of the argument that they had. It was an argument over their school. So I'm going to tantalize you with that, and I know you're going to look forward to reading that. It's a good story. There are also, probably one of the most moving things, that's what you see up there on the right corner. There are personal remembrances of the dead, and there are maybe 12 or 15 of those where there may be 3 or 4 different people. It's in 4 different handwritings. People recorded the deaths of usually elders, but sometimes children in the community. Probably the most moving one is the man named Nathan Johnson, who recorded the death of his own 12-year-old son in his arms, and he wrote about his son's last words and what his son's last moments were like. And we've reproduced a bunch of those in the book. Some of them will be in the appendix in the back, and some of them are in the main body of the text, and they will put a lump in your throat. So this ledger took me a few weeks to learn how to read. And at first I could barely read it, but Suzanne Johnson told me to give it time, and over time I would really start to get it. She also told me that she said, you're going to be sitting there at night and reading this and you're going to get chills. And she was absolutely right, because when you start to hear the voices of the people who wrote down these very personal remembrances, it's very moving. It's very moving. Uh, and even the spelling and the turns of phrase that they use when they're writing things down in this ledger lets you hear their voices. You hear how they spoke. You hear how they spoke. Everybody had their own quirks of speech. Uh, but it also shows, I think, how well organized they were. They had building committees, they had social organizations, they had legal documents, they kept good records. It's really remarkable for families that were coming out of slavery and starting with literally nothing, really nothing, 15 to 20 years earlier. They had to build all of their institutions from scratch. They didn't really have anything that they could just inherit as all of the other white towns in the area could. Somebody established the post office, somebody established, no, they had to, at Sugarland, establish all of these things for themselves. So you're going to like the voices from the ledger. I think they're extremely moving. Now, again, when I talk about natural born historians, this is a tradition that continues to the present day. Gwen and Suzanne and I have joked that anybody with that historian's obsessive impulse to gather and organize and preserve, that we're all a little bit related somewhere. And I think that's true. And case in point, here are two women at Sugarland, Gladys Mason and Bessie Lee, who collected obituaries from newspapers. And there are that one that I'm showing up at the top there on the left is one of the thinner ones, but there are some that are just bursting at the seams. They usually brought the newspapers home from the homes of white families where they were working, and they snipped them out. And they're not just obituaries of their immediate family and friends. They're obituaries of neighbors, other county residents, and sometimes for nationally prominent African Americans. I remember seeing one the last time I had a chance to look through these, for Pearl Bailey's mother. And that was just of interest to Mrs. Mason or Mrs. Lee, and they added it to their collection. And I think that collecting impulse helps explain why we have so much to work with when we sit down together to work on telling the history of this community. There are also, I took a picture down there on the right, binders full of funeral programs, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And these contain biographical information and memories that just aren't found anyplace else, that in many cases aren't yet digitized, haven't really been seen by anybody since the funeral. Now, the good news is a great deal of this information has been entered on findagrave.com by our tireless cemetery preservationist, Gwen Wallace. Thank you, Glenn. I think many of you listening today probably know Glenn. Glenn, also shares this obsessive desire to document history, and so he's stepped in and he's helped document the cemetery and put a lot of this info online. So when people are researching their roots, even if they don't live in the area anymore, they're going to come across some of this. So really, all of that stuff that you're saving now could be of potential use to your own families down the road. So the last real category I want to talk about, I'm just calling them artifacts of ingenuity, because there are just so many interesting things in the Sugarland collection and in the possession of Sugarland descendants that tell us more about who people were. So for example, here on the left, there's a painting of two generations of the Johnson family. And Sam Johnson, I'm told, was never seen without that cowboy hat. And the painting shows their house and blue skies and their open fertile fields, and really emphasizes their role as farmers. Now, I'm not sure who the painter is on this, but this is privately owned by a Sugarland descendant. But it again emphasizes that this was not a community of farmers in a little corner of the world just keeping their heads down. They were confident about who they were in the world. They were proud of their role in the world. They were proud to be self-sufficient farmers. And there they are in the painting, looking at you head on with a great deal of confidence and pride. So over there on the right, we have a quilt that was made by Shirley Ann Coates Taylor, who passed away in 2006. And she used this to honor 3 generations of women in the Hebron family. And you can see their pictures going diagonally uh, through the squares of the quilt. Now, this is in the possession of the Sugarland Ethnohistory Project, but for quite a while, it was on display at the Reginald Lewis Museum of African American History in Baltimore. That's the museum right there where the Inner Harbor meets Little Italy. And that was there as part of a larger exhibition for quite a while. And what I love about this quilt is how Shirley Taylor is thinking about the history of her family and interpreting it and being creative about it. This wasn't just names in a ledger or in a record. She chose to represent them in a particular way and to show them in these elegant portraits and with designs of her own making all around them. So, you know, anytime you're creating something, you're expressing really who you are. But I think I probably saved the best object in the collection for last. If you've if you've never been to the Sugarland Church, I would like you to meet Sam the sea turtle. Uh, if Apparently this sea turtle came up the Potomac at some point, and Sam Johnson, who's in the painting in the previous slide, caught him and preserved him. And I had to emphasize during the talk on Tuesday that Sam the sea turtle is no longer alive, because when I gave this talk at a similar talk at Poolesville High School back in December, the ninth graders were really distraught because they thought that that Sam was still alive with a broken beak and living in that little box. That is not the case. So the turtle's been preserved in this case and named in honor of Sam Johnson, who preserved him. And Sam the turtle came home to Sugarland in 2014 after a sojourn with another Sugarland descendant in New Jersey. And the students at Poolesville High School, when I asked them to kind of brainstorm what Sam the sea turtle can teach us, and they pointed out that he's proof that people in the community had a wide range of unexpected skills, even if they didn't have the formal training in those skills, and that other people probably underestimated what they were capable of. And I think that's right on. I think Sam the turtle is really a symbol of ingenuity and experimentation. And you know, Gwen Reese has told me again and again that Sugarland, they were really all about making do with what you had, and solving problems. And this was an interesting creative problem that Sam Johnson managed to solve, because this sea turtle is in pretty good shape for being about 90 years old. So anytime, as I said before, anytime you're creating something and it's not about your basic survival, it's expressing who you are, and you're telling the world something about your interests and your personality and what you care about, and even your eccentricities. And I think this is definitely an eccentricity. And we go, whenever I meet Gwen and Suzanne and we sit there at the front of the church and discuss things, there's Sam staring at us. And I think it wouldn't be the Sugarland Church anymore without him. So Sugarland today. Let's talk about what's there today and what my friends there are working on. So the school and nearly all of the houses are gone, and most of the community has been reclaimed by the forest. And along the edge of the community, if you drive there now, since the early 2000s, lots of big estates and horse farms have grown up around the edges. But the church from the 1890s is still standing, and it's open. It's a strong little church with sturdy bones. And it's, as you can see in the bottom, it's really very pretty on the inside too. And it's open on county history weekends. It's used for funerals and weddings and reunions and school tours and other events. And it was also used, by the way, most recently in the 2012 movie Philomena, starring Judi Dench. For those of you who've seen that movie, it played a Catholic church. It got dressed up like a Catholic church on the inside with statues and a baptismal font and all the things you would expect of a baptismal church. And Judi Dench goes inside, so they use the inside and the outside. So the BBC helped to fix up the belfry, so the bell now rings again. And the money from the BBC also helped them modernize the heating system. So the church is still it still has air conditioning and heat, so it's good almost all year round. The cemetery behind the church is still active, and the most recent burial, I believe, was just this past winter. And in the nearby woods, you see there on the right, there are the Seneca red sandstone foundations of some of the original cabins. and those are awaiting further research by archaeologists and others who really kind of want to get a sense of how people lived. And you'll be surprised when you look at some of those and you realize they're cornerstones of homes, and you realize just how small some of them actually were. Now, even though most of the buildings are gone and a lot of people are living elsewhere, I think it's important to point out that uh, even though there isn't really a town there anymore, it's still a community. There's still a community. Sugarland descendants are spread out across the country, and there are a few in foreign countries. And they always talk about Sugarland having been a large extended family where people pitched in to help each other out. And I found just in the last couple of years that that's still the case. Everybody's still pretty well connected, and it doesn't take a great many phone calls to gather people for an important milestone event or for a reunion or something like that. And I I was there at Heritage Weekend last summer, and the sense of community when everybody comes together is really very strong. And you realize that people in the church and outside in the picnic tents are really are an extended family, and that they go back 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 generations. And it's quite a project for me to be involved in. It's quite a responsibility for me to come on board and take on even my small role in this. And it's been just tremendous fun as well. I've met a lot of people I never would have otherwise, and we get together and we just have fun, and the sources just keep coming out of the file cabinets and the basements and the notebooks and everything else. So, yeah, but this isn't being done in isolation. Uh, there's a wave of history right now, wave of interest in history in this little corner of the world. The Historic Medley District, which is our little organization in the Poolesville area, uh, has had standing room only programs about the history of the Western Upper County area. Up there, you see Kenny Scholes, who I think is going to speak in a couple weeks, who's very interested in historic homes and estates in the area. Uh, Historic Medley District has also organized ghost tours. Christine Ray leads those ghost tours beginning at the John Poole House in Poolesville, and those have been, I know, very successful and very well attended. Down there on the right, we have cemetery cleanup that I attended, and as you can see, quite a few other people did as well. That was a historic cemetery on private land. The organizers put the word out, and so that's only a fraction of the people who showed up. People showed up, and we cleared out that cemetery in about an hour and a half from probably decades of overgrowth. And we found not only the burial sites of the wealthy white family that lived there, but the just right next to it, pretty much on the same plot, were the sandstone headstones and uh, and burials of the slaves who had lived on the estate as well. Now, we're not really telling people where that was because it's on private land, but it didn't take a lot of effort to gather the troops for that one. And then down there on the bottom left is a really important event that took place back in November. Uh, there was an organization in the county that is commemorating the lynchings that took place in Montgomery County. And this was an event to commemorate and remember and recognize and start dealing with the lynching that occurred right in the core of Poolesville in 1880. So as you can see, it was very, very well attended. It was a very moving event. And that's really this is just a sampling of the interest in local history right now. So I feel like this is a great time to be working on a book that helps write another chapter in this history. So all of these events and the interest in them also shows that we're all interconnected. And it doesn't have to be your personal history, and you don't have to have this be relevant to you, and you don't have to be a Sugarland descendant to find their story of interest, because it's really a very inspiring story of people starting with nothing and making sure that their children and grandchildren had a leg up in the world through a great deal of hard work. Now, the interconnectedness, I think, is clear when you look at the map of our Western Up County area, because out here we often talk about our 5 towns. And they're generally the ones that have been associated most recently with post offices. And we say, yeah, Poolesville, Bellsville, Barnesville, Dickerson, and Boyd's. But you zoom in a little more closely and you look at some of those blank spaces on the map, you realize it's not really 5 towns. All of those purple town names represent an African American town or settlement or community. They're not all still there, but many of them are still there. Jerusalem is still there. Big Woods is still there. Uh, and this really gives you a much more accurate sense of the way Black and white residents have lived among each other since the Civil War, in some cases before. So really the history of this area is incomplete without knowing Black history, no matter who you are or where you're from or what your background is. But you also need to know the story of these white towns and white communities in the area to get the full story of Black history as well. These histories are intertwined and interconnected, and you really need one to understand the other. And I think that's true not just of our histories, but I think it makes clear just how we all need each other outside of the history books as well, especially when we're all dealing with the things we're dealing with today. So thank you. Please keep an eye out for the Sugarland book this summer. We're going to be making sure all the local history organizations know about it. We're going to be getting out the word about it, and should be available, I'm hoping, by about early July or so. And as soon as we can all gather for in-person events, I'm sure there's going to be some sort of event where we can hold a party and a celebration, probably at the Sugarland Church, to celebrate getting this history out there. So thank you for joining us tonight on a Friday night at the end of a difficult week. And please let me know if you have any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Jeff. Again, if you have any questions, please use the chat function. I did have a couple that came through here.
Okay, great.
Well, one is a question. I got a couple, two statements here.
Okay.
Let me just turn this video off here. Okay, so someone says, thanks for the opportunity to learn about Sugarland. Clarification, the sogginess makes perks for septic systems difficult.
So what does, I'm sorry?
The sogginess makes perks, I'm assuming percolators for septic systems, not wells. I'm assuming, I think is what she was saying there. The next question I have here says, where were the community schoolhouse and also the community well located? We moved here recently and are very interested in the history.
Okay, the well is in the woods right next to the church. It was on a private homestead. It's probably all grown over by now. And in the spring, you can't really even see it anymore. And I really don't recommend people go trespassing and looking for it, especially this time of year with poison ivy and quite an abundance of snakes. But it was not far from the church, right there on Sugarland Lane. Now the schoolhouse was just right up Sugarland Road. If you're driving and the church is on your left, and then the cemetery is on your left, the church was up there just a ways, really within short walking distance. The schoolhouse was replaced in the 1920s by a Rosenwald school, and that was a school that was partially funded by Julius Rosenwald, who was the head of Sears Roebuck. He helped provide funding to build Black schools all around the country. And when in the 1930s, when Black schools in the county consolidated, that schoolhouse became a private home and was converted into a residence. And at some point, I'm not sure when, sometime before my time, it burned down. And I think there's a big modern house where it used to stand.
Okay. Someone here says, deeds to married women and researching African-American communities in other Maryland counties. I have seen quite a few such transactions. I am intrigued, but have no explanation.
Okay. Well, one of the things that we're going to be talking about in this book is who sold the Sugarland residents the land. And about, I'd say 75–80% of the land was sold by one family that had one representative in the area. Then the other members of the extended family were elsewhere. And my hunch is that in the 4 or 5 cases where the deeds were written out in the names of the wives, it's because the elderly white widow, who was the sort of agent for some of these sales, probably knew some of these women because they worked in her home and helped her keep house, because this woman is shown as living alone in the census records, but there's no way that she could have maintained a large home in the area by herself. So that's what I think the connection probably is. But again, it's one of those stories we may never quite be able to tell, but it's intriguing. And again, it's more complex of a story than I think many people would expect.
Okay, here is a two-parter.
Okay.
Says, where is the 1941 social survey? Oh, hold on, my screen jumped there, so apologies. Where is the
Hmm.
1941 social survey available? Also,
Okay.
have you uncovered any of the slaveholding families of the first generation of freedmen that built Sugarland?
Well, uh, the social survey that you're talking about is in, I believe that the Jane Sween Library at the County Historical Society has a copy of that. Uh, it was commissioned, I think, by the Montgomery County Community Chest in the late 1940s. And the section that's surveying the African American experience in Montgomery County was really just one small chapter of it. It's a social survey that covers all aspects of the county and economics of the county and demographics of the county. And that's one chapter. It's a very interesting and revealing chapter, but it's one part of a much larger piece that I believe you can get uh, from Sarah at the library. And
Yeah, I'll
I'm sorry,
just
what was the second question?
well, let me just comment on that real quick before I answer the question.
Okay.
Obviously, the Jane Sween Library is closed at this
Oh,
time,
yes. Thank you.
but obviously, once things open back up, we'll be back in business.
Yeah.
If you do have research questions, you can contact um, Sarah Headland at the Research Library. If you visit our website, montgomeryhistory.org, and then click on research, it's the second option there for the Jane C. Sween Library. Sarah is able to accommodate some remote research requests. There's also a lot of resources available online on that page and then on our connected page for anyone who's looking to do some research. Okay, let me move on to the second part of that question.
Okay.
It says, also, have you uncovered any of the slaveholding families of the first generation of freedmen that built Sugarland?
Oh, the slaveholding families. Oh, yeah. Yeah. In the late 1860s, the state of Maryland did an ex-slave census, and this is available. I don't know if it's available online, but I don't think it is.
It
But
may be available in the Sween Library. I don't
it
know that
is.
first. Yeah,
It is.
yeah.
It's available in the library. I have a photocopy of it that I've been working with, and because the many of the slaveholders in Maryland were hoping to get compensated after emancipation, just as slaveholders had been in other places, including the District of Columbia. So there was a statewide survey done, and it lists the names of the former slaves and their, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, and their ages, and the name of the slave holder, and occasionally if they've been ill or if they have any injuries or something like that. So in many cases, but not all, you can connect the African American founding families of Sugarland with a local family. Not in every case though, and what I found is that there are at least a couple of families that, for whatever reason, did not participate in that census. And maybe they thought that because these were now their free neighbors. Maybe they just felt it was a little unseemly not to, or unseemly to participate in that. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure, but yes, in some cases, and there have been a few cases where those families and the descendants of the African American families have gotten to know each other and befriended each other, which I think is really very nice.
Okay, sorry, I had myself muted there for a second. It says, I believe this person probably came in late to the talk. But she asks, you may have said this, but how did you come to be the writer on this project?
Oh, I heard through Caroline Taylor at the Montgomery Countryside Alliance that they were looking for volunteers at Sugarland for the Sugarland Ethnohistory Project. And I, I, I really don't exactly have a surplus of free time, but I was really intrigued by what they were doing at Sugarland. And I wrote to Gwen Reese, I think it was New Year's Day 2019. I just wrote to her and told her some of my background in writing and researching different periods of history. And she immediately called me up and we met and we hit it off immediately. I feel like we've all known each other for a whole lot longer than we have. And in our first meeting, and if they listen to this at some point, they're going to laugh because they had an agenda for what they wanted to accomplish in 2019. And I think they had put it together before I had even contacted them. And number one on the list was a history book. So uh, I went and I met with them. We talked. They started to introduce me to their history and their resources, and the rest, as they say, is history. It's been a wonderful experience. I I love them as my friends, but I also really respect and admire them as historians and researchers because they've learned to clean gravestones. They've learned how to preserve documents so they don't crumble. They've gone and they've learned a lot of things on the fly that some people never really learn how to do to make sure that all of these resources are there for another generation and more. So that's it. Was really I answered a Facebook post and 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 the next thing I knew, it was 18 months of immersion in Sugarland, and I'm so glad I did it. It's been a blast.
Okay, the next question is one that came up in the previous talk, which is
Mhm.
interesting. How did Sugarland get its name?
Ooh, I'm glad you asked. Uh, well, the story at Sugarland in the actual town, if you ask somebody in recent decades, would be that the town had its name because the women there were sweet as sugar. Uh, well, the historical record actually goes back a lot farther than that, as far back as the 1600s, when the area was known as the Sugarlands, probably because of a huge abundance of sugar maple trees in the area. Now, there's an area across the river in Virginia. There's an offshoot of the Potomac known as Sugarland Run over there as well. So, the sense is that the whole area was known as the Sugarlands. And later on, when settlers came in and surveyed the area and broke it into big parcels, the parcel in that area was known as Sugarland Forest. And it was pieces of Sugarland Forest that then got broken off in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s to form the Sugarland community. So it's a name that goes way back. I've heard a couple of other theories that people have put out, some outside theories about maybe the name was a mishearing of a Native American word that referred to the soil. Uh, but the fact that there was a sugar maple industry during colonial times in the area suggests that it had to do with the trees in the area.
Okay, the last question I have here is one, just a nice general closing one here we've got. Is there a way that if people are interested to find out more about the book or about Sugarland in general, a contact method for you?
For me, yeah, if somebody needs to reach me, they just email Matt at Montgomery History. He can pass the note along to me. If you would like to reach the Sugarland Project, they have a website. It's sugarlandproject.org. It has many more photos. It has some more history. It has more information on there, and you can reach Gwen Reese, who's there waving in the picture when she's reachable directly. Uh, Everybody's pretty easy to contact. There's a Facebook page, but because of the way it's the Sugarland Ethnohistory Project Inc., it's a little hard to find because of the way the words are jammed together, but it's online. And the various county historical organizations have offered to help us get the word out this summer when the book is available. So there should be, if you live in the county, if you're on social media, if you're following what the county groups are doing, probably by early to midsummer, you should be getting word that the book is out, and we'll be delighted to be able to put it in people's hands. As I mentioned, it's a fundraiser for their nonprofit. I'm a volunteer, and every dime from this after printing is going to go into their coffers to help them preserve all of this and to continue research for another generation and beyond.
Okay, yeah, and again, if you have any more questions for Jeff, you can reach out to me at mgagel@montgomeryhistory.org. I do have one more question, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, Jeff, but
Okay.
says, is someone also regularly checking the info@historicmedley.org email? I don't know if that's something you
I'm
know.
not affiliated with the Historic Medley District, so I'm not sure. That's our organization in the Poolsville area that covers local history. They've been doing a lot of really interesting programs in the last couple of years, but I don't know who the contact person is there right now, and I'm sorry about that.
Unfortunately, I don't know that either. If you if they're not responding, I can try and reach out to them. Just send me an email.
And
See if
it's
I
a
can.
small town area out here. We're never more than 1.5 degrees of separation from anybody. So I probably know somebody who can put us in touch with the board. That's the way things are out here in the Western Up County area.
Yeah, and I'm sure someone that I know is probably the same way. So
Exactly.
and history organizations are like that. It's everybody who knows everybody else. And
Yes.
being slightly new to the Maryland area, I'm still working on my connections. But I think that's it. I don't see
Okay.
any other questions. Yeah, and obviously the future is a little uncertain at the moment, but we will Montgomery History will certainly be working with uh, Sugarland people to put together an event when the book launches. I think that'd be a very welcome. And I'll, Jeff and I will be working out details with Gwen and the other wonderful people out in Sugarland to figure that out. With that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up. I want to thank all of you for coming. This was a great talk. I'm glad we were able to do it again, and we had a great turnout again. Jeff, thank you so much. Again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to email me. That's mgagle, that's MGAGLE, at montgomeryhistory.org. And we hope to see you next week for more of the presentations. And with that, I'll just wrap it up again by saying thanks, Jeff, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.